All those who are holding tickets outside are getting as fast as they can. I'm speaking out to you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking to the crowd on the outside, who seem to be standing rather reluctant to come in, and we're going to start this very soon.
Welcome to Worthy's 2022 Halloween special. My name is Jon.
And I'm Ben.
And today we want to talk about our top 5 favorite horror movies of all time. And we're simply going to go from 5 to 1. But before we jump into our favorite horror movies of all time, I wanted to talk a little bit about our introduction to horror films into the spooky world. And I wanted to start off by asking you, Ben, how you really got introduced to horror. Is there a particular movie that you remember being introduced? Did your older brother or did your family kind of introduce you to the horror genre or specific movie?
Yeah, so I think my introduction to horror, it could kind of spoil the list that we're going to be doing and talking about because those movies are on there. But I will say that one of the earliest movies that I remember, and you're going to find this funny, that I remember my dad being like, oh, that might be a little too scary for you, is Batman Returns with the Penguin. And I think like, you know, I was probably like maybe 5 or 6 when I was like, oh, there's this Batman movie, Dad. Like we have this VHS. Can I watch this? And he's like, maybe not that one. And then watching, I'm like, okay, I can see where like the Penguin, like Danny DeVito's Penguin's like a little scary for a kid. Maybe a little too intimidating. But that was like,
Definitely.
That was probably the first time that I remember being like, oh, there's something called horror. And then I remember going to Tower Records as a kid and going through all the different CDs, and they had a big movie section. There was definitely a ton of horror movies and displays that I was just like, I don't want to be near that. That's not for me. But then as I got older, I think I was 5th grade, and one of the movies that I will talk about in the top 5, I dressed up as that character, and then I kind of just got into the genre. I'm not like the most well-versed horror person. You're very well-versed in horror and the genre. And it's a genre that I definitely respect, but it's also a genre at times where I can find it to be a little too goofy. And I think that's just how people take in horror and what kind of horror they like. I know some people really enjoy the kind of wacky, out there, just randomness, kind of like goofy horror. But some of it times I really like the suspense, the thrillers, the kind of, okay, there's a monster in this movie, but I feel like there's a monster in my house right now. Like that's going to get me. That's from this movie type of thing. So bring it all back. Batman Returns, Danny DeVito. You were the first scary monster in my entire life.
That's great. I love that. That's a great story. And I do want to get back to your perspective on horror because that is really interesting. And I've always, not admired is not the right word, but I've always been very curious about like your perspective on that and where like comedy, I guess, kind of comes in horror and where it kind of crosses the line. But in summary, for me, it's kind of funny. For me, horror came. Obviously, there was the Blockbuster age, which we would grow up and go to the Blockbuster pretty close to my house, and looking down the many aisles of horror movies. Horror movies are really sold by like their amazing posters. So thinking about some of like the iconic imagery of our favorite slashers or our favorite like Universal monsters. And I just always loved going down the aisle because it felt like as a kid you weren't supposed to be walking down there, right? You're seeing blood, you're seeing like women's shirts being ripped open. Like there's a lot of sexuality that comes with horror as well. So it was always just enticing as a kid to kind of like peek behind that curtain in a way. But I think a lot of horror for me came, which is really funny enough, from parodies. It came from the Scary Movie series, where growing up, being born in like the mid 90s, they were very popular. Starting in early 2000s, they became really popular way to like take a bunch of horror franchises and spoof them and make a kind of fun parody out of them. But what's interesting about some of those Saw films, or excuse me, some of those Scary Movie films, is that they actually can be pretty scary, and they can be pretty scary at moments for especially a kid who has heard about the Freddys and all these kind of like scary monsters or these scary people that are serial killers, and then to have it kind of imbued in this comedy made it a little bit easier to watch, like a little like easier to kind of break down and understand as a kid because there was like some levity to it as well. But those always entice me to kind of go in and be like, oh, the original movie is kind of about Scream and wanting to watch Scream, and how the third one is about all sort like The Ring, and wanting to like go and figure out more about these movies that they're being made fun of and that they're movies that they're parodying. So then that led me, to discovering all the fun craziness when it comes to horror movies. And I love most slasher films, and the zombie is not like my favorite territory, but I've watched a lot of US and domestic horror films, but I definitely have a big gap when it comes to like Korean or Japanese and a lot of foreign horror films that I would love to watch. And there is definitely a horror film on your list that is a huge gap in my horror knowledge. So I'm excited to talk about that as well. But yeah, I wanted to mention a little bit about what you talked about of there's this thing in horror where it crosses a line sometimes of being comedy and a mixture of like comedy with horror. And sometimes things happen in horror movies that people find hilarious, and other times people would be like, that's appalling, that's very like graphic or offensive, like I don't think you can laugh at something like that. And that's where something like the horror genre becomes so interesting, because there's this difference of opinion that people have with this genre, because it's a difference based on probably their life experiences and how they see certain things. But there are some people that love horror movies, and they specifically look for horror movies that have a lot of humor in them, that either are like so outlandish or so goofy, or that maybe they weren't intended to be like poorly made, but they are a really low budget 80s horror movie that has kind of become a cult classic. And there's definitely a weird passion that people have where they are kind of seeking this so bad it's good kind of film when it comes in horror. And I always found that really interesting, because no one really does that for any other genre, I would say. Like not even an action genre. Like maybe that's like the other genre you could kind of stretch to where people act that way. But you're never going to talk to someone who's like, I'm looking for that like hilariously bad rom-com. Like no one's looking for that. They want a good rom-com that's funny and has relatable characters. But there's something about the horror genre that people just love, like the schlock and the campiness. And I think that may come from, the murder and the horror and just having it be kind of corny and not as terrifying as it should be is kind of funny in a way. But I also agree with you. I personally love both kinds. I love, the schlock, the really goofy side of things. And I also love the horror that you sound like you like a lot more, which is the more serious, the more psychological, the more kind of in real life things that could possibly happen, I would say. But yeah, tell me a little bit about that. Like, why do you think people feel that way about the horror genre in particular, and why do you kind of lean away from that into more psychological thrillers?
Yeah, so I want to fixate on that word schlock and schlocky horror movies. I won't say a name, but we do have a very good friend who loves schlocky horror movies, and there have been many times where I've gone over to their place and they pop it on, and I'm just like, why? Like, why are we watching this? And I think what it is that it's not. I think that it's like the people who make the film do care about the medium of filmmaking, but they kind of just take it away. And like, oh well, how goofy can we go with this? And while still making it bloody and gory, but it just becomes so goofy and out there that it's kind of a waste for what you could do with it. And especially because there are movies I really love in the horror genre that are bloody, gory, psychological, that really get kind of like stick into your mind, and you're kind of, you breathe heavily, you grip the edge of your seat. And when I'm watching those movies, I'm like, this isn't as engaging, it's not as fun for me. And I respect that other people do like it, but then at certain times I'd rather just watch other things. There's other things I'd rather spend my time with. And I've noticed that people who, I've talked to plenty of people who do like the schlocky stuff, that are into all this like gory shit. They're not into the same things that I am, to the things that I really love and want to sink my teeth into. And that's just how people's opinions and the way it works. So whether it's like truly like one thing I can pinpoint with these like schlocky horror movies, I don't think there is one thing. I think it's just a matter of preference and taste, because it's all part of the same genre. And I think the best thing about horror is the amount of subgenres that are in it. I think that we've struggled when we've talked on our main podcast episodes is when we get to a musical or a drama that isn't necessarily a drama, but it's an epic, but it does a lot of stuff with self-identity, but there's some comedy, but there's still some drama in there. And I think that with horror, you can clearly put something into a lane and say like, no, this is the subgenre that it belongs to. This is how this movie fits. This is where this connection, this is where it takes inspiration from. And I think that's like one of the best things about horror is that there's so many different approaches, and I think that a lot of people, there are a lot of great artistic directors who take from the horror genre and put it into their own movies. You know, think of like Kubrick. He has The Shining as part of his repertoire, and that does not the same. He doesn't make that kind of movie over and over again. Scorsese does Cape Fear, but how many Scorsese movies are horror movies? You have Tarantino, who does Death Proof, and it sits on the horror kind of genre. It's more of like it's part of that whole like Slaughterhouse, right? That combo movie he did. Mm-hmm. And I think that everyone, like a lot of great directors, will go back to horror. I mean, now I think of Spielberg with Jaws. Like that is part of our repertoire, but it's not like the main thing. So it kind of just shows like it is a great genre, and you can do a lot of great things with it with the medium of film. And then going back to my original point with the schlocky movies is that they don't. I'm not gonna say they were disrespected, but it's not what you can ultimately do with it. You can do more, you can have more, but they want to have fun with it, and I respect that, but it's just not for my own personal taste.
Yeah, I totally get that. I totally understand that point of view, because sometimes I do feel that other side where something that is goofy or has a kind of goofy finished product when it comes to the film, the performances, maybe how it looks. I think sometimes it's frustrating because a lot of horror films have to have, usually most of the time, a decent story or a decent premise. And sometimes when it's not executed in a very like serious manner, it feels like it's underwhelming or it could have been better. So I totally understand that point of view. And if you're listening and are curious about all the fun subgenres and all the many subgenres of horror, you can go back to our last Halloween special where we kind of reviewed some of our favorite horror movies, what kind of Halloween means to us, and as well as the horror subgenres. So I think it is time to move to our top 5 horror films of all time. And moving forward, I would like to do this every year, so it would be fun to see, some of the new movies that we watch. Maybe a new film comes out and that somehow makes it into our top 5, or we watch a classic film that we watch and say, damn, this deserves to be on my top 5 horror films of all time. And like most films, we're on a filmic journey, right? And we're not going to have seen everything. We're not going to see some of the classics or every one of the Universal classic films, but I think we've created a pretty decent list here for ourselves. So, Ben, let's start out with you on your number 5.
So my number 5 is The Mist, the 2007 film directed by Frank Darabont, and it's actually the last film that he has directed. It came out in 2007, so he just hasn't. I don't know why he hasn't made anything since, but this movie was really fantastic to me. I remember watching it as a kid. And the monsters are really scary. The idea that, and based off of Stephen King novel, the idea that this mist comes over this town, and all of a sudden these monsters start coming out, and they're trapped in this one location, and they're just struggling and fighting to get out to survive, not letting the monsters in. And the story, it's very suspenseful. I get very into it. But then the ending of the movie is one of my favorite endings because it's a downer, and I'm not going to, should we say spoilers? Is this a spoiler podcast? I know there's some movies that we don't want to spoil to each other we haven't seen, but I don't know, John, should we spoil?
We've both seen this. I say spoil ahead. Okay. So spoilers if you haven't seen The Mist.
All right, so spoilers for The Mist, but the ending where the main character, he is in the car with his son, this woman that he has like this emotional romantic relationship with. It's kind of odd. It's not like fully fleshed out. I think it's 2 older people. And the decision is, well, I just have to kill you all with the 4 bullets I have left in my gun. And then after he kills them, he goes outside thinking the mist will take him, and the mist disappears, and the army arrives, and everybody survives, except he has to look on like, what the fuck did I just do? And that sort of ending is kind of like the monster wins. And similar to a movie that came out recently, Smile, I like that because the ending is the monster sort of wins. So it's very shocking, I think, to have that happen, and that's like one of the psychological things that I love of horror is you're thinking the entire time that, okay, maybe there will be a way. Oh no, there is no way. They're going to get defeated. That's sad. But then the twist is, oh fuck, there was a way. And that's ultimately why I think The Mist has stuck out to me. That this was a hard 5. 5 was the hardest one for me to figure out because there are other movies that were battling for it. I think the closest one that could have gotten to it was Saw, which also has a great ending and reveal at the end.
Absolutely.
You know, so that's what I love twists. I love how movies ends, and horror movies have a great ending. It makes it a very good watch for me.
Absolutely. That's one of the hardest parts, I think, about the genre is just landing that finale. And I think The Mist is a great choice to have on a top 5. I think the only really issues I remember from the film, it's been a little bit, is, you know, some of the CGI doesn't hold up with the monsters. That is kind of dated, but, you know, Frank Darabont is one hell of a director and one hell of a writer. I mean, he made one of my favorite movies of all time, The Shawshank Redemption. And you asked, where has he been? Why hasn't he made anything? And that comes down to The Walking Dead. I think, so basically what happened, The Walking Dead, he originally was the showrunner, I believe, and writer for the first season, I think. And that was 2010, so it was 3 years after 2007's The Mist. I think it was a big deal for him. The show was extremely successful, and they basically tried to like boot him out to get, I think, new people in for a cheaper amount. And I'm really generalizing here what actually happened, but it came into this whole lawsuit and really messy, classic Hollywood of just, you know, people fighting at, you know, with their hands scraping to get money that they're owed for shows. And it's funny that another horror franchise, which has become, you know, one of the biggest horror franchises of all time, especially when it comes to television, like The Walking Dead, how that kind of broke our boy Frank Darabont. So great choice for number 5. Moving on to my number 5 favorite horror film of all time. That is 2011's The Cabin in the Woods, directed by Drew Goddard. And this film stars a very young Chris Hemsworth of the time, and basically follows a group of kids, classic horror premise, who go to a cabin for a fun, horny weekend, and horrors begin to come out of the cabin. Let me just say that. And if you haven't seen this movie, I'll probably spoil just the basic premise. I think if you haven't seen The Cabin in the Woods, it's a really wonderful film that just loves horror movies, and they wear horror movies on their sleeve. And there's always something I love. I think I mentioned it early on with scary movies and that whole quadrilogy. I love films that parody movies, but there's nothing quite like a parody that is also so damn good at being a horror movie. And you'll see another movie on my list that it's very similar in terms of tone and the way they executing, being a love letter to horror movies, but also being pretty damn scary as a movie itself. And I think The Cabin in the Woods not only sets up a really fun, awesome science fiction premise, but it also has all the fun that you get from a horror movie. You know, who's going to be the final girl? Why is she the final girl? Why is she the last one, to survive? And maybe we kind of dive into some of these cliches in horror movies. The cliche monsters, we get to see so much in this movie. And I just love a movie that gives you everything. You know, it tries to go for it, and it's funny. You have your classic slutty character, your stoner, your handsome jock, and your nerd. You know, this movie is so written so perfectly, and it gets all of the beats that a horror movie should. And like I said, it makes a film that is also still scary. I think the main villain or monster, these kind of like hillbillies, zombies, I'll call them, are great. They're super creepy, and they're haunting these young group of kids. And the movie is just full with twists and turns, and I think I love it from that point on. You know, from the very opening credits of how we're thrown into this world that is, you know, holding all of these monsters, and they kind of are basically testing and having bets on who can survive and which monster will kill which person, and all the craziness that comes from The Cabin in the Woods. So I gave my number 5 to The Cabin in the Woods from 2011. Ben, what is your number 4?
So my number 4, and this is maybe a recency bias, but I chose It, the 2017 version. And I say that more because it was a kind of a bonding experience with not just you, but friends of mine from back home. And I saw it with them, and we all loved it. And I know I was talking about schlock, and sometimes, you know, comedy in movies can be a little, in horror movies can be a little like, for me. But the Pennywise character portrayed by Bill Skarsgård is horrifying but hilarious at the same time. There are so many great moments where I cackle with laughter of what Pennywise is doing. Number one being, I think it was the character is Mikey when he's getting beat up by the bullies near the riverbed, and he turns over and he sees Pennywise like eating a child's hand, and Pennywise just like waves it, smiling. Oh my God, is that hilarious? But then I shit myself, scenes later when he's popping out of the projector, or he's scaring them in his haunted house. The teeth, how big his mouth gets, like that is horrifying. But it's funny when he's dancing, in that little trolley thing towards the end of the movie. So it's one of those movies that I think is a great homage to other horror. It's a great character and villain and Pennywise. It's more modern, so I think that because of that, the approach is more technical. It can do more. The visuals are more in your face, whereas when you watch the original It movie or other horror movies, as a kid you thought were like really like, that's so scary, but now you're just like, oh well, that's made in the 80s, it's made in the 90s, it's not as scary. But this is more recent, so it's like it's scarier, keeps you on the edge. And I just absolutely love Pennywise. You can constantly hear me go, hiya Georgie, and
hiya Georgie,
hiya Georgie, and come down in the sewers and play, and you'll float too. I love it. I love, and that's where a character, it's a great example where a character can really enhance a movie and really bring it all to you without any other thing in the movie factoring into that. I think, I'm not saying that Skarsgård is Heath Ledger's Joker, but Heath Ledger's Joker does a similar thing where just that alone is what brings you into The Dark Knight, and that's not included in the other fantastic things about The Dark Knight. And to a similar effect, that's what Bill Skarsgård does with Pennywise. I was actually a little bullish that during that year, I was like, he should just get like a Best Supporting Actor nom, because it's like that in your face and that good from that year. But, you can't always get what you want. But yeah, It, number 4 for me. Love it. Don't love Chapter 2, but again, Bill Skarsgård knocks it out of the park as Pennywise in that one as well.
I think you're absolutely right. And, Pennywise is just a wonderful character, and Skarsgård did really bring that character to life. And I don't think it's crazy to say that he deserved it. I think a lot of people would be like, oh, well, it's makeup and it's special effects. But, you could say that about any role, and you could say that about Heath Ledger's Joker. So
yeah, but like the drooling, the mannerisms that he does with that character is so sinister.
Absolutely. And I think that's what that movie does so well, is create a character who you can laugh at times, and is a character that you are like so interested in, and you kind of like this character, even though you're so scared by him, right? Like you're so fascinated by just how odd he is, and if he's human or if he's not, or what he is really. And
yeah, let me just read off the Best Supporting Actor for 2017. So Sam Rockwell won for 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. That's a great performance. Then you have Willem Dafoe in The Florida Project, another great performance. Woody Harrelson again in 3 Billboards, really good. Richard Jenkins in The Shape of Water, all right. But this is the one you got to take out. Christopher Plummer and All the Money in the World. Like that was just because he replaced Kevin Spacey and they did all that. And he's Christopher Plummer. Like why not? Like that could have been a perfect spot where you're like, let's honor it, like because I definitely remember where they have that like 10-minute Oscar clip or movie clip at the beginning of the Oscar. They're showing all the great stuff. There's 100% a Pennywise insert shot in there of Bill Skarsgård, and they couldn't even nominate him. So that's my little Oscar rant for the episode.
You're absolutely right. And Defoe should have won that year. I love Florida Project.
You're not wrong.
Alrighty, moving over to my number 4, I'm going with 1996 classic Scream. This is directed by Wes Craven. And what is there to be said about the classic Scream that hasn't been said? You know, we're on the 5th movie. I think they're done now filming the 6th, and it's supposed to take place in New York. I'm so excited for that. I love a classic horror film or a franchise and just do something weird, like, you know, throw them in New York or throw them in space with Jason X, and just doing crazy stuff with the franchises. I love it. But focusing on the original, the 1996 Scream, just what a wonderful movie. It is exactly similar in the way that I feel about The Cabin in the Woods, where it's something that feels fresh, but it's also very much, you know, hitting these beats. It's commenting on a lot of our our fantasies, the things that we love about horror movies. You know, sometimes there's nothing scarier than just a killer talking to you on a cell phone, and the amount of fear that he can bring up in your life by just telling you things that like are very personable. You know, the opening scene with Drew Barrymore is one of the most iconic opening films ever. I think if you were to just, it's definitely one of the most iconic. It's up there with the opening to Halloween. You know, there's so many amazing things from Scream that have not only commented on the previous horror up until that point in the 90s, but it also kind of extended and pushed horror further, repopularized horror and slasher movies. And I think that then later on led to the mid 2000 kind of reboot remake era, where we see a lot of remade or sequels that have been kind of repurposed and remade off of these older franchises. But, you know, Scream is just amazing. It's in this perfect time where we're seeing the growth of technology and how that kind of changes movies, and how technology allows us to talk about more movies, to maybe obsess over movies, to obsess over maybe like people like serial killers, or, you know, it really expands on our viewpoint, our obsession over horror movies, over slashers, and over real life deaths as well. But it also is hilarious. It's a really funny movie. I think Wes Craven is, you know, one of the best horror directors of all time, and he knows exactly how to make something very scary and build up the tension with Ghostface as the killer. But he still also has such a witty sense of humor, and he's so good at, you know, creating these like fun original characters that are spunky and have a lot of bite to their character. And I absolutely love this movie. I mean, obviously we've seen this series grow so much over time with David Arquette and Courtney Cox and Rose McGowan kind of becoming such an important part of the series over time. But I absolutely love Scream. I think it's a movie that I can continually go back and watch every year, and I really love the franchise and how it's kind of changed and adapted over time.
Yeah, you definitely know when a movie has maintained its like place in the horror genre where everybody wears a Scream mask as a kid. It's
yes, absolutely.
It's a constant part of the Halloween costume and getting dressed up. I think I even wore one once as a kid. I remember the coolest thing about a Scream mask was when it had like a heart that you could squeeze and it would put like blood into them. You remember
yes,
exactly what I'm talking
about.
I know
exactly what you're talking about.
I don't think kids today get to experience that kind of fun when they dress up. But yeah, Scream definitely stands the test of time. But moving on to my number 3, and this is a movie that I have been trying to watch with John for a very long time. And don't hate John for this. He's just a baby. He's innocent. It's not his fault. There's a ton of things out there. But my number 3 is Rosemary's Baby, 1968, directed by Roman Polanski. And again, it fits into that psychological thriller, what the fuck is going on type of thing that I love in movies. And I'm trying not to like say too much without revealing too much to John. But another movie that I felt that it's a more modern version of this is Hereditary. I'll stop it from there. I won't say much else. But yeah, Rosemary's Baby. I love it. It's a movie that I will go and show people when they're like, "Oh, what's a good like thriller?" I'm like, "You should watch this." And it just the ending is really good, but it's just a whole build up throughout the whole movie that like keeps your heart racing. That you're, what the hell is going on? How are they involved? How is this person involved? Like, it's so good. And I don't want to say too much because then I'll start spoiling it. But I am going to get John to watch this movie if I have to strap him down and Clockwork Orange him myself.
Yeah, it's not intentionally. I'm not avoiding this movie. It's kind of been one of those films that has built up over time so much that it's now become this enigma that I'm like, when is the right time to watch it? It feels like there's got to be a perfect moment for me to be like, all right, it's finally time. I'll do it. And
well, do you know maybe what Rosemary's Baby is a reference to?
No, I have no clue.
All right, then we're not going to even try and speculate here.
No, I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole to kind of see where it might lead and tell me more about the movie. But I've kind of tried to separate myself from it as much as possible. And I've seen Repulsion, another Polanski film that I think a lot of those a lot of the time those two movies are kind of put together in terms of Polanski's films, and they have some stylistically kind of similar things about them. But it's a movie I've always wanted to watch, and I think this Halloween, this season, the last kind of week or so we have left here, it's finally time. I think another thing about that movie is I've heard just how it can be quite traumatic, and a movie that's like 2.5 hours, that's that heavy, sounds like a lot. Sounds like a lot.
I don't know. I didn't find it traumatic, but I can definitely see where the suspense of what's going to happen, and as you're watching for the first time, you're just not having any idea what's going on. I think it's similar to what I was saying to like the modern version of it is Hereditary, and maybe you're not going to pick up on why it's like that until you watch that movie. So I think we should just move on. You give me your number 3, and hopefully this time next year we're just doing a straight up Rosemary's Baby review. Maybe that's the 2023 episode. That's it.
That would be fun. My number 3 for my favorite horror movie of all time, currently in 2022, is 2014's The Babadook, directed by Jennifer Kent. Man. This is my most recent film, right after The Cabin in the Woods. This is 2014. So, I'm like 1 year out of high school. I was not expecting to absolutely adore this film. And it's the only, I think so. It's our only female director across the board on our entire list. Really, because there's just not enough female directors, obviously, in the entire industry, but there's also just not enough in the horror genre as well. And man, I really love The Babadook for everything. Honestly, it is such a good movie. I think it's up there with being called a perfect film. It's exactly an hour and 34 minutes, and every damn minute of this movie is tense, anxiety-inducing, and it just creates such a great monster. And I hope it's one of those movies where you create such a good monster, but I just hope it's never made into a sequel. It's not a movie that you're kind of having fun watching this slasher go after our characters. It's really heartbreaking. It's about a single mother trying to take care of her child, and she's reading him this children's book, and the children's book is kind of manifesting with evil, and it goes a lot deeper and darker until it manifests the Babadook, who is then kind of haunting them as a family. And it's a really simple, straightforward premise, but it's done and executed with such precision, and every shot feels so intentional and sharp, and the sound mixing is aggressive and has a bite to it every time it switches from scene to scene, and it is so real and heartbreaking, while at the same time all being like a large metaphor for grief and loss. And when a movie can combine those and have such a great story that it's trying to tell, and that leaves you with an emotional impact, and it's really one of those films too where you kind of get what it is by the end of it, and especially the last scene, or the last 2 scenes, I should say. And after you kind of get a feeling of what they're kind of going for, it's one of those horror movies that just gets better when you watch it again. And I think that's a really big rarity for horror films, is that usually after you watch them, it's like, okay, I saw the kills, I had my laugh, I had fun, I got scared, I can move on to the next thing, something that's scarier or bigger or whatever. But there's not many horror films where you can kind of go back and watch them, and they're continuously great, and they're continuously making you scared, and you care about the characters every single time. And not all films, when you go back and watch them, do you notice more details, and you pick apart the film even more, and you start to see like, oh, like there are hints here that I just didn't pick up on when I first watched it, the first 2 times I watched it. And man, it is just an absolutely beautiful movie. I think it's one of the scariest films on my list, and anyone should go watch The Babadook if you haven't seen it. I think it's quite a good time. It's both haunting, scary, and has a great story and message when we kind of wrap it up in the end.
Yeah, that's actually a movie that on your list that I haven't seen yet, and it's definitely a movie that I know is out there that I should go see. And seeing the poster and some of the stills from the movie, I'm like, okay, I can definitely see why that is so scary. And I think we should take a second to talk about just what really makes like a horror movie, and like what makes it stand out, especially on our list, because I feel like looking at it, like we have movies that are more like they're classic, but they're not like in your face gory. Like this is so scary, and maybe the Babadook does fit that. And I had a hard time while making my list because I was like, well, what is a best horror movie for me? And I categorize it as more the psychological stuff. But I did think, oh, do I really need something that's like so gory and so in your face that it makes you like frightened almost? And maybe that's just not my personal favorite, but I think that is essential to a horror movie, if that makes sense.
No, you're absolutely right. I think there's definitely a film we'll get to later on your list that it has that, definitely. It has that kind of like punch, that visual nature that is so kind of unbelievable that you're seeing what you're seeing in a movie, and that it's like so insane that they were able to like reconstruct something and make it look as real as it does. And that certainly is very traumatic and horrifying when you see something that's gory or violent. But it's funny, when I look at my list, none of my films are really like that. I think when you look at so far, The Cabin in the Woods is probably the most gory film that's probably on my list. But that's because it's trying to pay homage to like every kind of horror film. It's trying to pay homage to the murder slashers, to the monsters, to like the humans that are the real, horror in the world. So it kind of tries to do a lot. So I think I usually love movies that are just kind of a combination of multiple things, or it's just a really focused, tight film. Like The Babadook, which is a psychological kind of thriller where you're just like holding on, and it's a good mixture of psychological thriller with also being kind of a monster movie, but a good kind of combination of the two of them. But yeah, you're right. That's not what I look for in my best or most memorable kind of horror films. I do love some of those crazy like underground slasher films from the 70s where they're like insanely gory and it's like so vibrant red, the blood, or the D'Argento films that are just insane, and things like Suspiria that are really violent. And
I thought about
there's
Suspiria.
something definitely to those. Yeah, it's a terrifying movie. There's definitely something to those, and even films like Saw or the Fly. I think Saw is kind of like they're scary for sure, but they've become more almost action films in a way where like this death scenes have kind of like built up to be like an action scene almost, where as the franchise goes on, it becomes less and less scary. But I don't know. I think you're definitely hitting on something where usually people's favorites are not the crazy, gory, just, Fangoria, balls to the walls,
Yeah, and the Saw movies definitely go to that extreme, but I can appreciate what some of the Saw movies do. And, oh man, have you seen like all the Saw movies?
I've seen all of them, yeah.
Yeah, I just love how connected they are and how they pull off some of the things they do in those movies.
That's what makes them so great and so bad at the same time.
I mean, exactly. Like they're so like those can be schlocky at times, but then at other times you're like, wow, that was really well thought out in terms of how it connects. And what is it? 3 and 5 happen at similar times. Is that I forget? There are two of the movies that
I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember right now. There are two of the movies that are happening at the same time, and then when you get to that reveal, I think it's the later one, you're like, oh my god, wait a second, hold on, and that's the fun part of what you can do. I think of these movies that I think is harder to do with others, and so I just want to take a second to talk about just gore and how, as even though we don't really have too much of that on there, that's still important. But let me jump to my number 2. This is the least gory one probably on my list, and that's okay because it's one of the best ones ever made, and that is Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 Psycho. And I love Psycho. Psycho was one of those movies that I watched early on in my film-loving career and life that I was blown away. I love the psychological aspects of it. I loved how it's about the killer and it gets into the mind of the killer. What Hitchcock was getting to was so fascinating in how he wanted to tell this story. The roadblocks that were put up for this movie and how ridiculous some of the things, like it showed a toilet being flushed for the first time. Like that's interesting. But then the characters itself, Norman Bates it's so sinister. And when you see some of the scenes in the beginning of the movie, it's so like, oh my God, like this is truly like thrilling. Like my heart is racing. And I love it. I love the reveals. I love the twists and turns. I like what Hitchcock does to further the medium of film in the movies. And it's a movie that I forced my little sister to watch when she was, I think, like 10 or 11 years old. I was like, you got to watch this. I'm sitting you down. I'm forcing you to watch this. I scare the crap out of her, but it was worth it. It's a movie that I think that if you're trying to enter just the film as a whole, is a must watch. I think it's a very important film in many regards, but for the horror genre, it's one of the best. I know, like, there are tons of movies that came before it. There's the Draculas, the Frankensteins, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, the Invisible Man. There's all those like classic monster movies, but then Psycho comes out, and I think that starts to change the game a little bit. And to me, this is a movie that stuck true and through. I think that it is influenced so much. It influences my number one in many ways, and it still continues to influence movies. So Psycho, Hitchcock, we wouldn't be here without the master of suspense, and it belonged to my top 5.
That is a great choice, and that was so close to making my list. I was really struggling with it and kind of where to put it, and it almost wasn't my number 5, but I just love The Cabin in the Woods so much. Such a great time, and I really love Psycho, but it's not a film that I go back and watch very often. It is such a great film, and I love the way it kind of changes and turns into a different film, and how much it's gone on to, inspire slasher films and the horror genre in general. And I really think you should watch Barbarian, because Barbarian is like this weird homage to Psycho, but it's almost like the reverse anti-Psycho. So I really want you to go see this year's Barbarian, because it's great and it's wild. And man, Psycho, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, the shower scene alone is just one of the most like iconic moments in film ever, and how many different crazy shots they use. And that is a perfect example of something being very violent, but also not showing that much, especially from what we're used to and what we will later see in the 70s. But what a wonderful freaking movie, and definitely one of my favorite in terms of Hitchcock's films.
Yeah, it's a movie. I was just gonna say it's just a movie that it holds such importance that and I know, like, you want me to go see Barbarian. I think today it's on HBO Max, right? So maybe I'll pop it on after this. I know I didn't go see it in theaters, but
Turn the lights off when you do.
Don't turn the lights off?
No, turn the lights off.
Oh, turn the lights off. Fuck. Oh my God. That's I still get scared of turning the lights off after watching a horror movie. Like, when I came back after watching Smile, I swear to God I was seeing stuff in the corner of my eyes. Swear to God.
Well, I haven't felt that feeling of like on edge and seeing shadows or seeing people that aren't there than when I watched Barbarian. So I'm excited to see what you I'm excited to see what you think. Hereditary is probably the last film that I watched where I was like, all right, this is not good for my brain.
I stood up in the theater when during one of those shots where she's hiding in the corner, and
terrifying.
God, just wanted to scream.
So crazy.
And I'll never forget this, just because now we're going on a Hereditary rant for a second. When I first watched Midsummer, I was like, yeah, I'm going to go to a 10:30 at night showing of Midsummer, a little stoned and watching it. And I walked out at 2 a.m. like, oh God, where are the Swedes? The Swedes are going to attack me. The Swedes are going to attack me.
Oh my God. You're like, I'm never going there. Never.
Never seeing a horror movie at 10 o'clock at night again. Going during the day.
Oh my God. Yeah, Hereditary, I mean, if we're going to just throw that out there, I do think that's one of like the best horror films in the last decade for sure. I think it has to be in your top 5, and if it isn't, then yeah, you're kind of crazy. But
yeah.
Moving on to number 2, and my number 2, funny enough, is also probably my least violent or graphic film on my list, and that is M. Night Shyamalan's 2002 masterpiece, Signs. And I love aliens. I love a good invasion film. But what M. Night Shyamalan, or Shyamalama Ding Dong, or Shyamalamian, however you want to pronounce my man's name, he's one of my favorite directors of all time. But there's something that I love so much about him is that obviously he has his twists, his subverting of expectations. But what he really does so well is taking something that is maybe broad or or so much bigger than what the film appears to be. Like for instance, a comic book film or a superhero film, and looking at a film that he made like Unbreakable, which is this toned down drama and melodrama about a man basically on the verge of divorce is really what that movie's about. And he does the same with an alien invasion film here. He takes it down and he strips it down into a melodrama about faith and religion. And I've always loved M. Night. He's from Pennsylvania. I mean, we have a lot of weird things in similarity and in common. Obviously, coming from really close to the same region, he films a lot of his movies in Pennsylvania. But he also has a lot of interests that I really love, like when it comes to comic book movies, horror movies, the thrill that comes from alien invasions as well, and really focusing that on a family who runs a small farm. And it's an ex-pastor who's now kind of retired because his wife passed away, and he's kind of lost his faith in the world. And M. Night does such a great job. He's one of the best, kind of character directors who's so good at like molding and working with actors to kind of form these very realistic characters. And I know a lot of people will like poo-poo that and say he has some of the worst dialogue that's ever been written, but he can be hit or miss. I will always say that Shyamalan can be kind of hit or miss when it comes to some of his dialogue and some of those beats, but I really love Signs. Mel Gibson gives one of his greatest performances. It is such a beautiful, heartfelt movie, and it does such a great job of taking a huge world, global event like aliens invading and reducing it down into, for example, the birthday party scene where our characters are, you can remember that now. That can be stuck in your head forever.
It's one of the scariest scenes in any movie. And
absolutely.
There's nothing to it besides an alien walking across the screen.
Because it's the buildup of tension, and our characters are watching it on TV, and that like aliens are definitely coming, but you don't know when or how, or will it be an attack? And there's something about it not even being like an attack or a jump scare. It's so blatant and open, and the alien just like walks across the frame, right? And it happens so fast, but there's something like, it's giving me goosebumps just thinking about that now. Like, it is such a creepy, horrifying moment, and what an incredible score. I absolutely love the score from Signs. I mean, I can go on and on about this movie, but it is so great. Every detail about this movie is absolutely wonderful, and it really comes down to how great the characters are and the story. And I love it. It's a movie that has so much tension and horror, but it also has so much heart, and it's about the discussion of faith and believing and whether you can believe after something so horrific happens to you. So absolutely love Signs. If you haven't seen Signs from 2002, I think it'll definitely change your opinion about my boy M. Night.
Yeah, M. Night, I think post The Village is not his best, but The Village is a great movie to me, and I love that twist. I love the horror in that. And The Signs is definitely a movie that I remember watching as a kid that left me on the edge of my seat and made me feel, especially that birthday party scene. I was like, oh my God, okay, just breathe, Ben. You're good. It's just a movie. You're going to be fine. And so I definitely agree with that. So I guess without further ado, I will reveal my number one. And my number one is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the 1974 movie directed by Tobe Hooper. And this movie, good old Leatherface, is exactly why I love it so much. I love the character, the monster, this enigmatic, mysterious creature that you never see the real face. They wear other people's faces, runs around with a chainsaw, all these jump scares, body horror, it's gory. And for 1974, it was pretty shocking to see all that in a movie. It's pretty experimental, the movie. The ending is so twisted. And then the ending with him swinging the chainsaw around and I feel like Joaquin Phoenix's Joker kind of ripped that off. And when he's doing his whole dance after kills, he's just so blissful. And it's like this happy, like ballerina dance with the chainsaw at the end that I just love so much. I love that the Tobe Hooper was like, this is based on true events. And reading upon that, he was trying to attract a wider audience. And it's like a subtle commentary on the political climate of that time and how, and I think, and it's a response to Vietnam that because we were showing so much gore on our own televisions of showing the war, that to just do it in a movie felt like a commentary on it, that where you can go to all these extremes now because we've revealed so much horror in the world. And it's just such a great experimental movie. That movie, I can understand if people are like, well, that's like a little schlocky when you look back on it, but for 1974 it wasn't like that. This is like the first true kind of one of the first, I can't like say it's the first, but it's probably one of the first like true slasher movies to come out and inspire so much. Like from that point forward, it's definitely a heavy inspiration on the horror genre as a whole. And I absolutely loved it. And I said that there was a character I dressed up as. I know I said I wore the Scream mask probably once, but I definitely remember 5th grade getting the Leatherface costume. I had a toy chainsaw. I put the mask on, put the apron on. I wore it to school. And I don't think many kids really got like, what the hell is Ben wearing? But I was like, it's Leatherface. Come on, it's good old Leatherface, right? Come on, guys. So yeah, I'm a big Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan. All the other ones that come out after it are, I like them a lot. I know the 2002 is kind of goofy. After I watched it recently, and I remember as a kid being so scared watching that, and then watching it recently, I was like, oh, this wasn't scary at all. But then there are other iterations of Texas Chainsaw Massacre where it's pretty, oh my God, like what the hell? And like, oh man, I forget the one where, and I get in spoilers for this one, there's one where you think the girl's getting away, and then at the end of it, just Leatherface sticks the chainsaw through her from the back of the car, and she just drives off the road and kills like a cop inadvertently. He just drags the chainsaw walking away again. And it's so just like this character, there's so much you can do with it that I think I'd be happy with more Texas Chainsaw movies. I'd be happy if they redid that character more and more. So big fan of it. That's my number one, Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, that's why I was kind of hinting at. You were saying that there's not that much violence and visceral kind of gore, but man, that movie is haunting and disturbing and just so violent in a way that's not like, you're not really directly seeing people getting their heads cut off, but like seeing like skin for a chair or a lamp or like people's skulls. Like it was like one of the first times you would like have ever seen anything like that. And it's so fucking creepy. The way the movie is filmed with all the intense close-ups and the way like her eyes, I really just think of like the dinner table sequence when I think of that original movie and just how disturbing that is. And like, I remember the first time I watched that probably like a decade ago and thinking like, this is like way too disturbing. Like how the hell was this even made? It feels so real that it's kind of crazy that they were able to pull off something like that, especially in 1974. And it's so funny that that's your number one, because only 4 years later, my favorite and my number one horror movie of all time is 1978's Halloween, which, only comes out 4 years later, but it also is credited as being like, one of the defining slasher films that kind of like carry on the genre. And it's funny because obviously they're both from the 70s. They both show their age and maybe some of the cliches of the films of the 70s, but it's crazy how different these two films are when you compare like Halloween and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And Halloween, like they're both very independent, low budget films for the time, but Halloween is so much more of a straightforward kind of slasher film where you have Michael who kind of escapes and is just on a rampage nonstop, just chasing after these local babysitters in this town of Haddonfield. And the movie is so simple. And I think when a lot of people go back and they're like, oh, people talk about this as being one of the best horror movies of all time, and they go back and they see like our lead killer getting like stabbed by a knitting needle, and they're like, what? Like, this isn't very engaging or dynamic. But I think this movie is still very scary. It has a part in me that like I watched when I was a young kid, and there's something about horror films where there's a likelihood or a possibility that they could happen that makes it even more terrifying to me. And I think there's no better perfect example of a horror film that could happen other than Halloween, which is just, someone gone a little rogue, gone too far, and goes down this crazy rabbit hole of becoming a serial killer. And obviously, it does such a great job of defining fall, what Halloween looks like, having all the trick-or-treaters, having the kids with the babysitters, and how that kind of became a core part of the franchise. And moving forward, the franchise gets so messy, and we're now on the third kind of ending iteration to the series with Halloween Ends that came out this year. So just as a series as a whole, it's been all over the place and crazy, and it's had its ups and downs. And I just still go back to the original and just see this is such a damn good movie. A movie that has like stuff that you may not remember, like with some of the characters talking to like the cop in the film, and how there's like maybe some side conversations, and maybe some of the dialogue of the teens is a little just it's not the best. It's a little on the nose, and some of the performances are not the best. But what this film does is create such a great atmosphere, and it creates such a great atmosphere of what Haddonfield is like as a town, how we're set directly in fall and Halloween, even though this was all filmed in Los Angeles, I believe. But it also creates such a terrifying killer, this kind of blank face of Michael Myers, and how he just kind of walks and walks and walks, and he's always following you, and he's always going to catch up to you. And that nature of just truly being terrified of this presence, the shadow, as they call him, and this kind of figure that is so haunting. And obviously you have the amazing Carpenter music that is kind of propelling us forward and pushing us forward. And it's like, there's no way the movie would be nearly as good if it weren't for that iconic score of Halloween. And, John Carpenter has had ups and downs in his careers as well. I just watched Vampires by John Carpenter recently, and that movie was terrible. It was so bad. He made it like 20 years later after Halloween, and I couldn't believe how bad it was, and that this was the same filmmaker. But Halloween, I think, stands up still. I think it's a film that I'll definitely show my kids when they're older, and they'll watch it and be probably just as scared as I was at the time. And it just has created a character like Michael Myers who has stood the test of time. And now 40 years later, 50 years almost later, we're still seeing this character in cinemas and loving his adventures and his murder rampages. I love Halloween so much, the way they kind of build up the mystery of what is evil and how that can kind of personify in a human being, and how that kind of is truly relatable to a lot of us. We always were scared as a kid in the dark, or looking out, or wondering if there's someone out there who is a troubled character that could maybe cause some harm. I think it's a constant fear that we all have, and it really just taps perfectly into that. And obviously, I mean, Jamie Lee Curtis is wonderful. She's one of the best final girls. She's probably our last real final girl left in film. And I mean, what else can you say about Jamie Lee Curtis? She's wonderful and has such a soft presence in a movie that is so nonstop and kind of abusive towards her character. So Halloween is wonderful. I'm sure most everyone has seen it. But it was a film that I watched when I was younger, so it really stuck with me. The opening scene of Michael killing his younger sister, it was so inventive to me, and not having seen the internet at the time, and not having seen all these YouTubers film so much first-person content, and being used to that, and seeing something from like a first-person point of view, and then being it like a murder, like very much a node and to a Psycho and that famous iconic shower scene. It just continued to kind of push horror forward, and we still see how it's kind of affected the horror genre as a whole. And it still, I think, is one of the best slasher films and my favorite horror film of all time. Ben, where do you stand on Halloween? What do you feel about maybe the series as a whole, and especially the original 1978 classic?
Oh, I think you said at the beginning, it's a landmark kind of movie to further the genre and its importance. And I think a character, like you're talking about, like Michael Myers, this sinister, faceless, killer on the loose is what can drive like really good horror, and it's a great movie. It hits every beats. I think there's a lot. I know you're really into the sequels and how the franchise has developed. I think there's a lot you can do, and I'm sure there's going to be more Halloween movies to come out. They're not, like, Halloween does not end, John. It is going to keep going forever and ever on. I can't wait for Halloween Forever, the 20th installation of the of the Halloween franchise. But but I'm saying that because it really can keep going and going and going with a faceless character with with just like Michael Myers. He's this killer. It's going to come after you. Like, it's so iconic that that I think to say anything else about it would be to disregard it. Its importance to the horror genre, just like with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th. Like, those four are like the core, I think, of horror movies. And since the 70s and 80s, I think those are what have driven the genre to where it is today. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. And we get some of the very violent, like the Hostels, the Saws, and the Final Destinations that come from like the mid 2000s, and then we have the revival of Blumhouse and the Warner Brothers kind of horror universe with The Conjuring and these kind of ghost films like Insidious and demon films like Insidious and Conjuring. And that's kind of where we've gone, which has been nice. It's been very stylized and kind of, they're great to look at. I think Warner Brothers always makes and puts a good, decent amount of money into these films. But you're right. These horror legends are always going to be with us, very much like the Universal classic monsters that we kind of talked a little bit about as well. And, there's so much horror and there's so many kind of ways that people end series and end horror films that I was thinking about like how to end this podcast. And I think there's no better way to end the podcast by discussing how to end a horror film. And I think that is always such a hard thing to really land on because there's two sides of it. There is the quote unquote happy ending to horror films. Let's use Halloween's not the best example, but let's use Scream as an example, right? We figure out who the killer is. We stop the killer. Our final girl survives. She's maybe, beat up and lost some of her friends, but she's alive. She made it out. She's successful. So we either go that route or we go down the rabbit hole of The Mist, your example of The Mist being such a traumatic, harsh ending to a very bleak film. And I think a lot of films, and I think it happens pretty often where films have multiple endings and they kind of decide with testing audiences or internal decisions whether it should be one way or the other. But there's always that question of what is better. Should we end on this last scary horror beat, or should we leave them with success of a completed journey? We kind of defeated evil. Maybe we can hint that the evil can come back or we can have a sequel still. But tell me your thoughts on the perfect horror ending.
I think that it should be a horror beat. I think that the happy ending is a little too wishful thinking. I like it when it ends on a horror note, on a low note, on a one final gotcha kind of thing. And so I think that's how I would end a horror movie if it was my choice. It would definitely be, what's one last knife I can put in this corpse? Like, what's one last wound I can open up? What's one last thing I can do? What's one last jump scare? Sinister laugh.
Absolutely.
That I can put in there. Maybe just like a little cut to black, and that's just it. Roll credits. Put the, again, like going back to what I said before about Smile, like the way it ends and just the abruptness of it, and then just the what was the song, lollipop oh lot, like that. Like that thing is just like, what the fuck, like why? I think like that.
Yep.
That like leaves you so like kind of a shell of yourself. Like walking out of the movie, I was just like, okay, all right, let's I'm gonna walk to these dark streets now. Yay, great. So that what about you? What do you think about endings of horror?
I do love the kind of last knife in the chest. I do love the way you kind of phrase that. And I think there's certainly the time and place for that. And I think certain horror films definitely work better that way. And I think they probably thought of maybe a happy alternate ending to Smile. And either this was the original ending or they had both and they decided to go with a darker ending. And it does fit the movie. And I think it also gets an audience to want to go back and watch that film again, and or they'll tell their friends and like, oh, just wait for how crazy the ending is. And that kind of a very abrupt, just like smash to the face ending makes you want to go back and rewatch the movie and be like, I want to experience that ending again. So there's definitely some value in that. And also the value of like the last thing you'll remember is the very end. And I think a good example of what you're mentioning or kind of speaking of is Nightmare on Elm Street, the iconic ending to that movie where you have them kind of successful. She kind of gets away. Again, she lost all of her friends, but she's alive and her mother's alive. But then there's a gotcha at the end, you know, like Freddy's still out here. He's kitten her, you know, rips her mom through the front door window. And it's so 80s and goofy and ridiculous. But it is another kind of gut punch to kind of end the film and a dramatic ending of the film. And it's also why I love Halloween so much, is because of the ending. And it has its cake and eats it too. It does both, where it is a successful ending where, you know, she got away, she survived, the cops finally show up, but Michael's gone. And we're just seeing, you know, empty shots all around Haddonfield of just, is he there? Is he in the frame? He's not. Could he be somewhere hiding? You know, the thoughts of not knowing is usually like the scariest thing in horror. I think people always say that, like not seeing something or not knowing if something's in the darkness or the shadows is a lot terrifying than sometimes seeing it directly lit, you know, on film. So I just love the ending of Halloween. I think that is like such a perfect example of, you know, we can kind of leave this open if we want to continue it. But the ending also signifies how our leading character kind of feels. Like she's kind of hollow and very disturbed by what happened. And she's kind of left to worry, will this person come back ever again? Will the person hunt me down and find me again? And that's something so scary about that. And I always think of that and something like It Follows, which is kind of a newer film that kind of leaves you with that kind of haunting, chilling ending. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of different endings that you can kind of take down and maybe work better with certain horror films. And I don't really think there is a perfect horror film. I think there's perfect horror endings or perfect horror endings for horror films, but you know, there definitely are perfect endings for certain films and certain horror films. It just has to be the right kind of tone. You know, I think it really comes. Smile is a very tongue-in-cheek film, not just in terms of obviously there's a lot of smiling characters, but it's like it knows what it's doing. It has 100+ years of, you know, horror history to kind of play off of and kind of mess with the viewer with all the jump scares. It's very tongue-in-cheek of being this kind of like monster, you know, demon entity film. So it's a very smart way to kind of end that with like a gut punch at the end where you think you're going to get away, but you don't. So it works very well for that film. But Ben, is there anything else that you would like to kind of hit on with our Halloween special of 2022 or anything else you want to mention about the great horror films that we spoke about today?
You'll float too, John. You'll float too.
Oh, hi, Georgie.
Hiya, Georgie. No, it's kind of it. I think we really hit on it. I love talking about the horror genre. I think it's a genre that there's so much to explore and watch and see, and I think it's a genre that filmmakers and audiences have truly grasped. I don't know why. I think people just love being shocked. They love the adventure, the entertainment of chaos, and I think that because it's so surreal and so fantastical, but yet so real and so rooted in I could see a person go on a murderous rampage like this. I think that's what makes it stand out so much among audiences. So keep watching horror. Love this time of the year, and it's a dark and stormy night, my freaky little friends.
Thank you for listening. My name is John.
And I'm Ben. And this is Worthy. Thanks for listening to Worthy, the breakdown of every Best Picture winner from past to present. You can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Check us out on Instagram at Worthy Podcast, on Twitter at Worthy Pod, and on Facebook at Worthy Podcast. Any inquiries can be submitted to worthysubmissions@gmail.com. Again, that's worthysubmissions@gmail.com.